Well, hello there, Year 7. Mrs. Henderson here. Long time no see. Some of you were taught by me at the start of this school year, or you might have had me for a cover lesson at some point. If you notice me looking down at any point, by the way, it's just because I'm looking at my notes. Either way, it's nice to be back, and I'll be setting the next 4 or so lessons for you of history, but I would continue to access them the same way you have been doing through Miss Theka's YouTube page. I nearly said Miss Pika there, that was bizarre. Just because obviously it's easier for you all to do what you've been doing so far while we've all been in lockdown. So this week's lesson, as the slide says, will look at James I and religion. The main question we want you to consider is, how successfully did James deal with his problems during his reign? Now, hopefully, with a combination of the information I give you during this lesson, the cogs turning and whirring inside your heads, and with the tasks you'll be required to do by the end of this, you should have hopefully identified what the main issues or the main religious issues were during the reign of James I, and you should then be able to evaluate, which means consider all the arguments for and against in lots of detail to come to an overall judgment or conclusion as to how successfully overall you think James was in dealing with his religious problems. Okay, so you look at the positive and the negative things that he did and decide how successful he was. Okay. If you could briefly pause this video and copy down the main title, so James I and Religion, and the subheading, which is how successfully did James deal with his religious problems, that would be really helpful. Don't forget to underline headings and the title, and of course pop the date down as well. We might be teaching you and you might be learning in a remote way. There's clearly a worldwide pandemic occurring at the moment, but let's not let our standards slip, Year 7. Okay, so if you can pause me, if you haven't already been bored to tears, and pop that down, that would be great. Okay then, so moving on, before we look at James and religion, I know that you've obviously been doing a few lessons on the Stuarts so far with Miss Theka, and prior to that you have looked at the Tudors and how they dealt with religion and various other issues. Now, in your last lesson with Miss Theka, you looked at James I and finances, so to do with James I and money, hence my delightful little picture, which I think will be over here somewhere, of some, I think they're Stuart coins, they might be Tudor coins, but either way they're coins. So what I would like you to do is to have a think back to your last lesson and think about what was James's biggest financial problem and why. Okay, maybe press pause at this point or just when I'm finished speaking and talk out loud as if you were answering a question in class. So think about that question, explain your reasoning or ideas in response to that question in as much detail as you possibly can, using supporting evidence such as key financial terms, dates, events, key individuals' names, things like that. Once you've completed question 1, then try to think even further back to the lesson you had on James and his various different problems with Miss Theka, which was the lesson before. So you should have looked at social, political, financial, religious problems. In as much detail as you can, and I know you might find this hard to remember this, can you outline 2 religious issues that James faced during his reign? Okay, and I'll give you a clue. One of them is very, very well known and we commemorate it every year in November. If you really can't answer either of those questions without looking at your notes, then obviously you'll have to, but the whole idea is for you to revise information and to test what your memory can recall to help you with preparations for exams in the future. So that's why we kind of go on and on and on about you revising things, learning things over and over again, because it takes ever so many times of your brain doing that and recalling information and retrieving it for it to go into your long-term memory. So if you haven't already paused me, please do so now and complete those questions. Say them out loud or say them to a member of your family. Oh, Mr. Henderson's just popped past the window. I don't know if you saw him there. Exciting times. Okay, so just make me shut up and do the work, okay? And then we'll move on. Okay, so moving on, this is an incredibly detailed timeline, Year 7, okay? You really don't need to know about everything in this much detail. It's actually taken from an A-level textbook, but I have underlined the things that are really important for us to take note of, okay? So these are religious issues or events during the reign of James I, beginning in 1603. The millenary petition, which is the first thing I've underlined, is just as it states. It's a petition that was created by a number of Puritans at the time, which was then given to James, and it kind of told him everything they were unhappy about to do with religion at the time, or angry about, and things that they wanted James to change. And that was all discussed at something called the Hampton Court Conference. And Hampton Court is just a posh royal palace, basically, where they chose to hold the conference. The by and main plot were, again, as their titles suggest, plots to change the religion of the country and to overthrow King James and put somebody else on the throne in place of him. The Gunpowder Plot is probably the most well-known religious event of James's reign, and that might have been something that you mentioned in question 2 in answer to in the previous slide. Hopefully you knew a little bit about the Gunpowder Plot, when it happened, what happened. If not, then don't worry about it, because we're going to be learning about it today, but in a lot more detail in our next lesson together. You might be aware of the popular phrase, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. No doubt you'll have studied that topic at some level at primary school. We'll be touching upon the gunpowder plot today, like I said. The Spanish match is also important, as it involved attempting to marry Charles, who is James's son, who we'll be looking at in a few lessons' time, to an heir to the Spanish throne, so a Spanish princess. And as hopefully we already know, Spain's a Catholic country, because you've looked at the Spanish Armada and things, haven't you? And England was Protestant, so the idea of marrying his son to a Spanish princess really ruffled some feathers and certainly made Parliament quite unhappy at the time. And it just kind of added fuel to the fire that people in England and Scotland in particular were concerned that there was some sort of Catholic plot going on or some sort of conspiracy. Finally, we'll also be looking at something called the Book of Sports, which is the final thing that I've underlined. And you'll learn about that later on, okay? Hopefully, if nothing else, the timeline should introduce you to some new key terms before we watch the video we're about to watch. Don't get too excited, it's not very long, it's only about 2 minutes. It's probably not the most exciting video you've ever seen in the world either, and some of the language you might find a little bit difficult to understand. If you do, no worries. All I would like you to do, please, as you watch it, is make some notes under the heading Religious Problems under James. So if you now write down in your books Religious Problems under James as a side heading, and if you move on to watch the video clip, that would be great, and just see what this historian has to say about the kind of main religious problems during James's reign. And if he says anything about how successful he was, that would be great, because that would obviously help you out with your conclusion later on in the lesson. Okay.
One of the most controversial policies was the religious policy. Europe had been hit by religious war. Since the Reformation, there have been religious wars across Europe, particularly France, and there was a perception if you didn't deal with schism in your own country, there was a risk that you could, the civil war might erupt. And England had a problem with a strident religious minority. We think of them as being Puritans, although that term started as a term of abuse. And certainly James I and Charles I recognised that they had a Puritan problem that they needed to address. You know, would the Puritans cause so much trouble that they would ultimately end up being seditious? How do we keep them in check? There was also the problem that, having inherited 3 kingdoms, there were different religious cultures and different ecclesiastical establishments in all of the kingdoms. Ireland did effectively have an Anglican church, but it was a church of the minority. The majority of the population was Catholic. And how did you help promote Protestantism in Ireland without alienating too many of the Catholic population? How did you promote the right sort of Protestantism in Ireland so you weren't encouraging Puritanism to spread there? Scotland had had a reformation that had been carried out in the absence of a monarch. There had been a revolution that had overthrown Mary Queen of Scots, and the Scottish Church had initially developed independent of the crown. And when James VI, who inherited the Scottish crown when he was 13 months old, when he eventually reached the age of maturity, he found it essential to try and reimpose royal discipline, royal control over the church. So he wanted to revive bishops. And then when he became, he wanted to revive episcopacy. When he became King of England, he also wanted to try and bring the churches in the 3 kingdoms into closer harmony with each other, because as a divinely ordained monarch, as he saw himself, who was responsible to God and accountable to God for upholding the true religion, it was important for him to try and establish a true religion, the true religion across his realm. So he needed to bring them closer together. Doing that inevitably ruffled feathers. Puritans were upset, Scottish Presbyterians were upset. There was an attempt to impose English-style ceremonies in Scotland, which the Scots got very upset about. Charles I built on this project and pushed it even further. And so he tried to clamp down on Puritan practices. He took the church in England in a more ceremonial direction. He emphasized ceremonies which Puritans thought of as being idolatrous, such as kneeling for communion, bowing to the altar. He tried to make the Scots worship more like the English. And when he tried to make the Scots do that, they rose in rebellion against him. And that begins the troubles that are going to erupt eventually in civil war.
The main religious issues you should have identified while watching that video clip were that different religious groups within England, Scotland and Ireland were potentially a threat to the governing of the kingdom overall, and potentially called James's power and authority into question if they were a faith that didn't really see James as being head of their church. So schisms or splits within the Christian church were therefore potentially a problem for him, and could, I guess, lead to open conflict or rebellion. In Ireland, James had mainly Catholics to deal with, but there was a small group of Anglicans and Presbyterians. In Scotland, they were mainly Presbyterian and didn't accept the power of the monarch or the king in relation to religious matters. And in England, the majority of people were Anglican or believed in the Church of England, so it was going to be difficult for James to attempt to enforce Anglicanism or the Church of England upon all of those kingdoms under his control. They were unlikely to want to be uniform or the same, or to have union between them. Before we go any further, because you might be sitting there thinking, wow, Miss has mentioned a lot of key terms there were things mentioned on the video I didn't quite understand, things on the timeline, I think there are really a few key words that we need to focus on. So if you feel like you already know the meaning of these terms, absolutely great. Look at the screen now. If you think you've got it sorted, you can fast forward me. If not, I think you really might want to read them a few times, or perhaps copy them down, or if you're a visual learner like me, you can close your eyes and kind of see what can you remember, get somebody to test you, because it's really crucial that you understand the basis of this information before you then try to move on and evaluate how successfully James dealt with his problems and come to an overall judgment about that. You need to have kind of the basic stuff clear in your head first. So here are some important keywords you need to be aware of when studying religion during the Stuart period. Now remember, the Tudor period had seen quite a roller coaster of religious changes until Elizabeth became queen, and she largely managed to uphold a middle way in terms of religion. She was diplomatic, which means she was kind of fair to everybody, and on the whole dealt with religious affairs fairly and well. England had been Catholic, and then it gradually became Protestant under Henry VIII, then it became more Protestant under Edward, and then it became very Catholic again under Mary Tudor, before Elizabeth then finally established the Church of England settlement. So at the start of James's reign, everyone had very high hopes of him. His mother had been Catholic, so the Catholics kind of hoped they would have tolerance and acceptance from him, but he was brought up in a very Presbyterian environment, so extreme Puritans hoped that they would kind of do well during his reign. Try to think of the Christian church as being a bit of a spectrum. So you have, don't know which side this will work out. This is my first clip I'm recording, so wherever the Catholics are on this diagram, you've got extreme Roman Catholics at one end, and you've got extreme Puritans at the other end. Other denominations or branches of the Christian church fall somewhere in amongst these two extremes. So working from left to right, on the spectrum, Roman Catholics had been accepted under Mary Tudor. James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had been Catholic, so Catholics hoped that James would look kindly on them. Catholics believed in a hierarchy of priests and bishops, with the Pope ultimately at the head of the church. They tended to have quite highly decorated churches with ornaments, stained glass windows, things like that, and they worshipped the Virgin Mary and the saints. They were a very small minority of the population under James, only about 5%. You then move on the diagram and you look at Armenians. They were Protestant, but they wanted more elaborate church services, so sometimes people were sort of a bit suspicious of them, thought there was a bit of a conspiracy, thought that if the king at the time tried to introduce Armenians into positions of authority or power, that the country was sort of becoming more Catholic in nature. Armenians saw bishops as being very important within the church. Armenians are more of a problem during the reign of Charles I rather than James. Anglicans are members of the Church of England. They accept the king or queen as the head of the church, and they accept the importance of bishops. The majority of the population in England at that time were Anglican. You have to remember how important religion is to people at this time. And I'm not saying it's not to some people now, but most people at that time had some kind of faith, and it was something they were willing to die for. Naturally, the monarch of that time was more likely to favour groups of the Protestant church who supported the monarch, and therefore placed the king at the head of the church and gave them a lot of power, essentially. Remember, James had not been named as successor to the throne of England, and Elizabeth had had his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, put to death because of her involvement against Elizabeth in different Catholic conspiracies. It was important for James to try to continue the middle way of religion that had been carried out under Elizabeth, and to try to allow tolerance for all groups and all faiths on some level. But at the same time, I guess, he couldn't allow for his power to be challenged by the likes of the Presbyterians of the Scottish Church, which was set up independently without the monarch being involved, didn't have bishops or support the monarch as head of the church. So that was quite a threat to James. But this was a difficult balance for James to manage, as he was king of both Scotland and England, and if possible, he wanted to try to create a union or group them both together. He also had Ireland to deal with as well. Finally, Puritans were more extreme Protestants. They didn't like bishops. nor did they like wealth, so their churches tended to be plain. They were a minority of the population during James's reign, but a very vocal one, so they liked to tell him what they were unhappy about. They really didn't like the Roman Catholics, so they struggled with Armenians quite a bit as well, because of the Catholic nature of some of their worship, and James tended really not to like the Puritans very much. So what you really want to be doing is having a look at how James treated each of these groups of people, which we'll be looking at later on in this lesson, and thinking, well, did he deal with the Catholics successfully? Did he deal with the Armenians successfully? Did he deal with the Church of England or the Anglicans successfully? The Puritans and Presbyterians, okay? So that's why I'm mentioning to you these key terms and explaining them to you, so that then the information we look at later on in the lesson, as you're trying to evaluate, was he successful with this, was he successful with that, you can consider which religious groups he was successful or unsuccessful with. Now, in order for us to consider really how well James dealt with religious problems during his reign, it's quite important for us to consider what his aims were. So what was he trying to achieve in terms of religion while he was king? So here you've got three main religious aims that he had: to create a religious balance, so to sort of have a middle way approach where he sort of tolerated everybody really, I guess, and had a mixture of some slightly Catholic elements and some much more Protestant elements within his church. He also wanted there to be toleration towards Catholics, and he also wanted there to be an episcopacy, always struggle with that word, so bishops to support the monarch's power, to support the king's power. So how far did he manage to do that? Well, he does show tolerance for Puritans and for Catholics, I guess, during his reign, but he also does come down very harshly on the Catholics at various points, for example, in response to the Gunpowder Plot. So you have to kind of think, when you look at all of the information that we're about to look at in a moment, whether you think whether he managed to achieve his aims, essentially, okay? At the start of his reign, James said something in relation to religion. He said, "I will not persecute any that will be quiet and will give outward obedience," okay? So I will not persecute, that means sort of punish any that will be quiet and give outward obedience, so show outwardly in their behaviours that they were following what James wanted them to do. So what do you think that statement that James made means? So if you want to pause me, I think I've just shown you something random on my computer there by accident. If you want to pause me and have a think about that, or write down an answer to that question, that would be fabulous. So now let's move on to the nitty-gritty Year 7. So these are the main religious problems that happened during James's reign. There were more than this, obviously, because we can't tell you everything that happened ever in history, or even within 1 year, within one lesson, but these are the main things that you need to know about and consider, okay? So I'm going to read through them with you, hopefully to help you to make sense of them if you're a bit unsure. The first thing that we're going to look at is the Gunpowder Plot. So these are just little bits of information about each of these events to help you decide whether James dealt with them successfully or not, and for you to know what actually happened, what the event was. So the Gunpowder Plot. At first, James seemed to be quite tolerant towards Catholics, and he ordered fines, so money that they had to pay for being Catholic and for worshipping differently to how James would maybe like them to. So they had to pay fines, and those fines were to be reduced at first under James. However, in 1604, Parliament were worried about this, so James quickly became harsher towards Catholics and increased fines once more. What have I got up to? Once again, and ordered all Catholic priests to leave the kingdom. This led to the hatching of a plot to blow up the king and his government by a small group of Catholics. James was upset by this plot, He increased fines for Catholics, and they had to take an oath of loyalty to the king. Now, clearly the people who'd been involved were dealt with, so they were no longer a problem. Catholics were forbidden to live in and around London from that time onwards, and after the plot, Catholics gave James no more trouble. So it's up to you to decide whether you think he dealt with that issue successfully or not. Ideally, it would have been better, I guess, if it hadn't happened in the first place. And we could argue that it was James's fault in the first place, if you look at the information. But, it's your opinion based on evidence. So, Hampton Court Conference and Millenary Petition. So, as I said earlier, Hampton Court is simply a royal palace. This event took place in January 1604. The petition, which is just a document, it listed grievances, things that the Puritans were unhappy about, that they wanted James to change in return in terms of religion. It had been created by the Puritans, who were unhappy with some features of the Anglican Church. The Puritans were demanding an end to tolerance of Catholics and their traditions in churches. A close watch was to be kept on Roman Catholics to ensure that the import of popish books, so Catholic-type books, was to be kept to a minimum. Another change as a result of the meeting at Hampton Court was a new version of the Bible known as the King James Bible, and James really put his stamp on this because there were things that the Puritans really wanted to change, and James kind of said, actually no. This is how I want the Bible to be. I'm not going to make those changes you're asking me to make. Overall, the conference, though, was a failure. Well, it was a failure for the Puritans, as James did not really give in to many of their demands, but they didn't cause him any further problems for the rest of his reign. So it was a failure from their perspective, but from James's, you probably could argue he put a firm stamp on the situation and made sure that the Puritans didn't cause him any further trouble, really. Very much, anyway. Union with Scotland. So union simply means an attempt to kind of join with Scotland in terms of religious matters. So James had been brought up in Scotland, as you probably already know, in a Presbyterian environment, but his mother had been Catholic, Mary Queen of Scots. Therefore, people, when James first came to the throne, had very mixed feelings about him. Some people hoped he would move forward with the Protestant or the Presbyterian cause. Other people thought, well, his mother was Catholic, so hopefully he's going to be sympathetic towards us. But it suited James to follow the Anglican Church because of their support of church hierarchy, with James as head of the church, obviously as the monarch. James wanted to introduce the Anglican Church into Scotland. He introduced something called the Articles of Perth into the Scottish Church, but they were very unpopular, so they didn't have to be followed in the end. James had also prepared a new prayer book to introduce into Scotland in 1619, but he decided that actually that was a bad decision, and that he shouldn't introduce the prayer book. Charles, his son, on the other hand, was not as wise, and he does later introduce a prayer book in Scotland, which ends up resulting in war. So you could argue that James was quite bright and wise and diplomatic, and saw that it would be a bad idea to attempt any definite union with Scotland. But in terms of actually thinking, did he manage union with Scotland in terms of religion? No, he didn't, because it just wasn't going to happen. They had very different, very strong Presbyterian views compared to the Anglican Church in England. Finally, on this page, we've got the Book of Sports. So just to explain a bit of background about what Sunday mornings or Sundays were like at the time. Sunday mornings were dedicated to going to church, and remember, religion was very important to people at this time. Most people followed some form of religion. And then in the afternoon, they had some nice sports and games. Puritans didn't like the practice of Sunday sports. They believed that playing games on Sundays did not keep it as a holy day. This issue caused lots of quarrels and arguments. between the different religious Christian groups. So in 1618, James issued something called the Book of Sports to sort of give a bit of clarification, to make it clear to people what was allowed to happen on Sundays and what wasn't. The book listed archery, dancing, leaping and vaulting as suitable sports for Sundays. James ordered all English church leaders to read this Book of Sports to worshippers, but Puritans were so angry about sports being played on a Sunday at all that James allowed the Book of Sports to be ignored. So in terms of him trying to clamp down on the Puritans at that point in his reign, I would say you could say the Book of Sports was a bit of a failure, really, that he maybe didn't deal with the issue of sports on a Sunday very well. Okay, next lot of information for us to look at in terms of religious problems. We've got religion in Ireland. So Ireland was a really tricky one, and it had been for much of history, to be honest, to try to control in terms of the religions there. So in Ireland there were three faiths. There was the Church of Ireland and Presbyterians. Okay, so we've now got another 4 religious issues or religious events during James's reign to help you kind of come to an overall conclusion in terms of how successfully he dealt with his problems. So we're starting to identify some of his religious problems now, and you're then going to think about evaluating them, sort of arguing for and against how successfully he dealt with them, to be able to write an overall conclusion at the end of this lesson. So there were 3 faiths in Ireland: the Church of Ireland, which is Catholic, Anglicans and Presbyterians. James wisely decided not to attempt to create uniformity in Ireland, as he knew it would be a very difficult and potentially dangerous task, be very expensive, lead to war probably, and a lot of deaths. So he just thought, I'm going to leave that well alone. French marriage negotiations of 1624. In a marriage treaty between France and England, it was agreed that James's son Charles was to marry the French princess Henrietta Maria, and that she and her children should be allowed to follow the Catholic faith, and Catholics were to be granted acceptance or tolerance within England. James once again left the people of England, in particular Parliament, concerned that he was not dedicated to the Anglican Church, and they worried that his behaviour was sort of leaning towards being a Catholic, essentially. So you decide whether you think that was a successful move or not. Obviously, I would imagine it was quite popular amongst Catholics. Next, the 30 Years' War. So an anti-Protestant king had been elected as the next king in Bohemia. So the Bohemian people offered the crown to somebody who was a Protestant instead, Frederick of the Palatinate, in 1619. Now Frederick is a Protestant, and he happens also to be James's son-in-law. So this led to a real religious power struggle in Central Europe at this time between Catholics and Protestants, and resulted in something known as the 30 Years' War. Frederick was married to James's daughter, so James naturally became involved in this situation. He seemed to be trying to make peace with Catholic powers during this time, in part by trying to enter into a marriage contract between his son Charles and the Spanish princess. This did not go down well with Parliament at all, who obviously again were concerned that there was some sort of Catholic conspiracy, or that James was leaning towards Catholicism. It didn't go down well with a lot of James's people as well, since they're Anglican. Being involved with the war cost James's kingdom a lot of money, which again was very unpopular. Finally, when we're looking at these 4 issues, Charles I marriage negotiations with the Spanish Princess Maria. So peace had been agreed with Spain in 1604 after a long war and the Spanish Armada that you've previously looked at under Elizabeth. James wanted to use the marriages of his children to further his image as a peacemaker of Europe. He married his daughter to Frederick, an important Protestant. So to balance this out, he pursued a marriage between his son Charles and Philip III of Spain's daughter Maria. This became known as the Spanish match, and it was unsuccessful. Ultimately, it didn't happen because Charles ends up marrying a French princess, Henrietta Maria, instead, and it caused Parliament to really distrust James and to think that he was involved in some sort of Catholic shenanigans. Okay, so the final three issues that we might want to consider are Arminianism, first of all, during James's reign. So at first, James seemed to disagree with Arminian beliefs. Remember, Arminianism, these people are Protestants, but there are elements of Catholic nature within their sort of how they want their churches to be decorated and how elaborate they want their church services to be and things. So Parliament especially viewed Armenians with distrust. So during the 1620s, Parliament in particular were concerned about Catholicism because of the Spanish match. So James trying to marry his son Charles to the Spanish princess Maria. So later in his reign, it suited him to give jobs to Armenians within the Anglican Church because they supported the power of the king. They thought there should be a hierarchy within the Church of Bishops with the king at the head of the church. So religious tensions never really became serious under James, but he did cause problems for Charles in the future because Charles really promotes Armenians during his reign, and because of what his father has previously done, that makes them view Charles with a lot of distrust and worry and be concerned about this fact. Okay, we've then got 1603, the Buy and Main plots. Both were plots to remove the king from power and were linked to Catholicism. They were unsuccessful and those involved were killed or imprisoned. So obviously it's not ideal that he's had these kind of plots or conspiracies towards him, but at the same time they were unsuccessful. Finally, just a bit of extra information for you. James was very well read, so he was intelligent and he read widely, and he enthusiastically encouraged religious debate. So he encouraged people to talk about religion and what their ideas were about religion. He was actively open to engage in conversation with people about religion. So you decide whether you think that was a successful move or not. It's obviously a good idea to seem open to letting his people kind of make choices and decisions and discuss things, but at the same time, I guess if you encourage debate, you're possibly asking for open conflict and for people to disagree with each other. So now that we've looked through all of this information together, you know about James's religious issues during his reign and the various things that happened, and you know a bit about, or you should have already decided within your own mind, whether these pieces of information agree or disagree with the fact that James was successful or not in terms of dealing with religion. So the next thing that we're going to do, you're going to have a look back at that information yourselves, or you could try to write down some of it from memory. You're going to write down the question, probably across a double-page spread in your exercise books. How successful was James at dealing with religious problems during his reign? Now, you can either do spider diagrams here, so you could have one spider diagram which has very successful at dealing with his problems and have any information or evidence to support that line of argument on there. And on the other spider diagram, if you choose to do that, you could have anything that suggests he was unsuccessful in dealing with his problems. So you could, if you wanted to, cut the pieces of information out, but I'd prefer you really to be writing your own notes, either in table format, so arguing for and against on either side of your double page spread, or in spider diagrams. Yeah. There isn't really a right or wrong answer to this, okay? It's your opinion based on the evidence or the facts. So you'll need to pause me while you do this, while you come up with your list of very successful evidence and unsuccessful evidence in terms of how he dealt with religion. Okay, and this will help you, depending on how much evidence you have on either side, this will help you come to a decision as to overall how successfully James dealt with religious issues. Finally, in conclusion, how successful was James in dealing with religious problems during his reign? So now that you've identified arguments for and against James being successful at dealing with religious issues or problems, you're probably sick to death of me saying that phrase or reminding you of that question. It's time to reach an overall conclusion. So James wanted to avoid religious tension as much as possible during his reign, and he wanted to include or be inclusive of as many people in the church as possible. He was prepared to make concessions for both Catholics and Protestants, but not really extremists either way. So extreme Catholics he didn't have very much time for, and really extreme Puritans or Presbyterians he didn't have a lot of time for. So overall, I would say religious divisions were not that serious during James's reign. There wasn't sort of any really serious open conflict or anything like that within his kingdom. But does that suggest that James handled religion really well, or just that there wouldn't really have been any problems particularly with or without him? Because the question asks how successful James was, it's really asking how much he was successful or to what extent he was successful. So it's fine to mention in your conclusion that in some areas James was successful and in others he wasn't, but really in your overall judgment you shouldn't be sitting on the fence at all. You should be stating to what extent you think James was successful or unsuccessful. You could say overall I think James was rather successful in dealing with his religious problems because, or overall I think he was mainly unsuccessful in dealing with his religious problems because. So make sure, remember that you consider what his aims were, which we've looked at earlier on in this lesson. Do you think he achieved them or not? You need to include evidence to support your line of argument or opinion, such as dates, key terms and events, and you should, a conclusion, really needs to be quite a decent chunk of writing. It isn't just a short paragraph or something at all. So you need to include evidence to support your line of argument or opinion, such as dates, key terms, events, key people involved. You can make it as complicated or as simple a line of argument as you like. As I've said, you could consider if James met his aims or not. You could consider whether it was likely that it was actually James that was a success with some of these religious problems, or if in fact could we hand that success or failure, would that be awarded to his chief advisors or negotiators, because actually it was probably them who came up with a lot of his policies. You could also consider whether James caused a problem or not in the first place, as in can he really be blamed for being unsuccessful at something that was introduced or a problem that was caused by Elizabeth, for example, however he dealt with it. Did he deal with some religious groups better than others? Did he cause confusion by changing any of his policies at different points? I think we know the answer to that is yes, especially with the Catholics. These are just some ideas for you to consider, okay? I'm trying to help you, not baffle you. Lastly, remember that a conclusion is not just a sentence or two, okay? So it should be well explained with supporting judgment using evidence, as if it was written at the end of an actual essay, because you've essentially kind of done your paragraphs and your evidence and your arguments for and against within your table or your spider diagrams. A conclusion is the last thing that you write in an exam or in an essay that your teacher marks. It needs to be something a little bit spectacular. It needs to be something that they're going to remember. It needs to be well explained, not just a list of different random things. Okay? Good luck. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I would say James and religion isn't the most fun topic in the world. I really enjoy it, but that's because it's something I'm interested in. I'm a history teacher. I hope I've made it bearable or enjoyable for you in some way, and I will see you again for next week's lesson, which will focus on the gunpowder plot, year 7. Okay, so good luck, work hard, and until next week.